So, welcome back to Quiet Conversations. 2 years ago, in a UN conversation, an advocate against educational pluralism used Florida to argue about the dangers of freedom. He told me, haven't you seen what has happened in Florida? He told me about how pluralism and enabling parents to choose the education they want for their children has ruined the Florida educational system. Interestingly enough, I have heard this a couple more times in international debates in parallel, and while in parallel, many advocate for parental and minority rights in Europe are looking Florida as a paradise. Today, we are here to understand what is currently happening in Florida. And to answer these questions, we have a special guest who is at the front of education reform in the United States. Dr. James Shuls, thank you for being with us.
Thank you. It's great to be with you.
Let me introduce you briefly so people know why are you a legit person to talk about that. Like James Schulz is the head of the Key 12 Education Reform Branch at the Institute for Governance and Civics at Florida State University, a leading voice in educational policy. His work focuses on school choice, education finance, teacher labor markets, and character education. I don't think it does not get any better to understand what is happening in this gorgeous part of the world. Dr. Schultz is way more than an expert on Florida because before joining Florida State, Dr. Schultz was an associate professor and graduate program director at the University of Missouri St. Louis, where he also served as chair of the Department of Educator Preparation and Leadership. He's been deeply involved in both research and policy, contributing to the American national discussions on educational freedom and reform. And before to give him the floor, um, let me say one last line about him. James Schultz has a PhD on education policy from the University of Arkansas. You hear University of Arkansas, you are talking about a legit person on school choice. And yeah, and basically, I think he covered, well, and bonus line, he's also a father and husband of a lovely family. I think we can affirm that Dr. Schultz brings a unique perspective to the challenge and opportunities in K-12 education today. So, James, welcome to the Oidel podcast, if we can call that a podcast.
Well, Ignacy, thank you so much for that introduction. It's so funny that you started with that comment where you heard someone say, have you heard what's happening in Florida? Because I start the same way. Have you heard what's happening in Florida? But I say it from a very positive perspective because there are lots of amazing and wonderful things happening
Mhm.
in Florida. It's an exciting time. There's lots of exciting things going on.
So, I mean, basically, that's what I'm interested here to do. Why people are talking about Florida? What is happening in Florida other than Disney, Orlando, and nice weather?
Those are some great things and some great reasons to visit Florida. We have some wonderful amusement parks. But when you talk about education, Florida has been at the forefront of educational reform for about 25 years now, really. When Jeb Bush was the governor of Florida, he was the education governor. And so in the late 1990s, in 1999, we created one of the first private school choice programs, and he really led the way in advocating for a whole host of different educational reforms. And ever since then, we haven't stopped. I mean, we continue to innovate, to change and improve programs, to expand programs. And so now in Florida, you have essentially one of the best educational marketplaces in the entire country. We have robust charter school sectors, and we can get into this a little bit more about what these mean in the American context. But the charter school sectors, I want to say, serve over 400,000 students. We now have private school choice programs that are nearly universal in terms of eligibility, with over 200,000 students in one of those programs, 100,000 in another program. So we have these programs that are well established and that are growing over time. And what we're seeing is, as I said, a marketplace really start to develop. And this has been one of the things school choice advocates have always talked about, is that when you create these different types of programs to allow people to choose, you allow for markets to flourish. And what that means is new types of schools are popping up. We have small schools that we call micro schools that might just have 25 or 50 students popping up. We have schools focused on the arts and schools focused on all sorts of different things. And so you're seeing this thousand flowers blooming as different types of schools are created in this new educational marketplace. And so I think it's a really exciting time to see what is happening in Florida. All of these different types of school choice programs are empowering parents to choose the type of school that's aligned with their vision and goals for their kids. And you're seeing some amazing things happening.
James, before going into the details of some of these different formulas to empower families and empower parents, it's been a while since some of these programs have been implemented. As I was saying, the first time I heard that was a long time ago. What is the perception of citizens from Florida about that? Is there a is there people that are really afraid of what is happening? Are we seeing, as some people are saying, a breakdown in social cohesion in Florida? What is the perception in within citizens in the state?
Well, I mean, you are always going to have some body of people who are opposed to this sort of thing. I mean, the traditional public school districts still tend to be, many of them still tend to be opposed or at least a little cautious about school choice, especially about private school choice programs. So you see opponents that'll say, well, we don't like private school choice unless they have the exact same standards that we have. They should have the same exact requirements to teach all of the things we have to teach. And essentially, what they want to do is try to regulate the private schools almost out of existence, because part of what the private sector brings is this ability to innovate and offer something different. And so we do have some folks that are still opposed to private school choice or school choice in general in the state. But what you see is um, the vast majority of people, or at least a good portion of people, support school choice and benefit from school choice. And this is one of the things, I think, a key lesson from Florida is that when this program or when these programs started, they were small, but then they built a constituency, they built a base of people who benefit from them and support them. And over time, that group of people has just grown. And it's become almost commonplace. Let me give an example of what I mean. So I moved from Missouri in the middle of the United States to Florida. And in Missouri, we had a brand new tax credit scholarship program. And that is where individuals give a donation and then receive a credit towards their taxes. And then those dollars are then used to fund scholarships. And nobody knows about it in Missouri. It's brand new. Nobody's, hardly anyone's heard about it. It's just not common. In Florida, I went to buy a car, okay? And when I bought the car, they slid me a piece of paper and said, with your purchase, $100 of your purchase is going to go towards supporting one of the Florida tax credit scholarship programs, right? It was just embedded in their normal practice of what they were
Awesome.
doing, that when you buy a car, you're giving money to support a private school scholarship program. And so that's, I think, the difference between 25 years. You have like I said, brand new program in Missouri and well-established programs in Florida, so that they're becoming just part of the normal course of events. They're just normal. And so you asked the question about, do you see hostility? Of course, you still see some pushback, and there's a saying that the cost of freedom is eternal vigilance. I mean, I think we have to continually be vigilant to protect these programs and to help them grow, because there are always going to be people pushing against them. But by and large, Floridians support these programs.
That's awesome. I would be at this point really interested because you have introduced us a little bit to some of the initiatives that have enabled citizens of Florida to have more pluralism in their system. But when we hear some of these words in Europe, but also other parts of the world, we don't really understand what do they mean. So I would like if you could help us to go to navigate to some of the words. Like I'm thinking here about, well, I'm going to go one by one, and if you can explain them in order also to inspire, yeah, civil society people who are thinking about education policy initiatives to empower families, or also politicians that sometimes they are just fighting over one thing, it would be really helpful. So the first thing I would like you to develop a little bit is like what, at least so people can understand, like what is education savings account?
Sure. So an education savings account, sometimes it's easier to talk about the more simple version before we get there, because education savings account is a little bit complex. Uh, we, for a long time, have heard the term vouchers or a scholarship. And
Mhm.
a voucher would be when the government says, here's $7,000 or $10,000 or whatever it is that you, Ignacy, can use for your child to pay for a private school tuition. So the voucher tends to have one use where you can use it for one purpose to pay for private school tuition. And education savings accounts, what they do is they expand that idea so that rather than me give you a voucher where you can take it to the private school, I'm now the government is now creating an account, a bank account, where we're putting the dollars into a bank account that is flexible use and that you could use for many different purposes. So the education savings account can be used to purchase private school tuition like a voucher, but it could also be used to purchase your textbooks, or it could be used to purchase tutoring service or a whole host of other things. Some people are using it in some places to do some homeschooling type of things where they're educating their child some at home, but then they're maybe purchasing some courses from a local college, or they're purchasing courses from another public school or private school, paying for some tutoring. For example, you have students who might have some profound special needs, and sometimes the students with profound special needs, one thing that might help them is horseback riding, right? Therapeutic horseback riding. It builds strong core muscles. Like there, reasons that some kids might really benefit from that as a form of therapy. Well, in some education savings accounts programs, you could use it to pay for that therapy or speech therapy or other types of, supports that students might need. And that's the difference between a voucher and an education savings account, is that flexible use where the dollars could be spent in different ways that are approved, right? There's an approved list of
Yeah.
things they can be spent on. But it gives the individual greater control and autonomy on how to spend those dollars.
Do this amount depend on the needs of the child?
They can, and these programs are different, of course, in different
Ah,
states.
okay.
So the dollar amount can vary. And Arizona, for example, has a pretty generous amount for students with special needs. The students with special needs tend to require more resources, even if they're in a traditional public school. They tend to cost more money to serve them, right? When you have to pay for therapists and those sorts of things. So some of these programs will give more money to those types of individuals who qualify with what we call an IEP, which is an individualized education plan. And so if they qualify with some sort of special needs, in some states they're eligible for more money under those scholarship or those ESA programs.
Interesting. Okay, another word that we hear a lot, and there is a lot of confusion around, tax credit scholarship.
Yeah. The tax credit scholarship. And the funny thing about this is, and not to confuse you or your audience even more, is that I mentioned vouchers and ESAs. Um, the ESA can be funded directly by the government or by tax credits. And so it can be funded in different ways. Missouri's program has some elements that are funded by tax credits, donations, and then it has some direct appropriations now. And we're seeing similar types of things in Florida where they're funded by tax credits. Now, here's what that means. So in the United States, in most states, you have income taxes, right? So you got to pay a portion on however much money you earn. So
Not only
a
in the
tax
United
credit,
States.
yes, of course. Well, Florida actually does not have an income tax, so that's nice. But so we have these taxes, and what a tax credit scholarship does is it says instead of paying your money to the government in the form of a tax, you can donate to a scholarship organization. So you might give
Mm,
$1,000 to a scholarship organization, and if the credit is a 100% credit, that's like you just gave $1,000 towards your taxes. And there are oftentimes some limitations on this. So a state might say you can only give up to half of your tax liability to the scholarship. You can't give all of your tax money to the scholarship. Or the credit might not be a full 100%. So it might be 75% or something along those lines. So, of course, the greater the credit, the more donations you're going to
mhm.
get. So it's just a way in which the funding changes from being directly funded by the government, where the government is taking the dollars and putting them directly into the savings account or the voucher program. And instead, it removes it from the government and says the individuals are now funding it with their donations, and it sort of separates it a bit more
Mm.
from government control.
It's really informative. Yeah, I mean, that's really helpful because I can't believe, I mean, maybe in Canada, but no, that's quite unique of the United States, this system, no?
I think it's somewhat unique, and it's possibly because of how our state constitutions are written. That could be one element to it. And then one piece is I think there's also in the United States a lot of concern about government influence on private schools. And
Hmm.
so I think these two reasons caused the tax credit scholarship push. So some states have what are called a Blaine Amendment. Blaine was a senator
Yeah.
in the 1800s and wanted to prevent public dollars from going to religious institutions. And some that didn't pass at the federal level, but many states put those amendments in their constitutions. And so the idea or the thought as vouchers were starting to become prevalent in the United States was states thought that they were not allowed to do it because their state constitution prohibited it. And so they could get around it by creating this tax credit scholarship program. And as the United States Supreme Court has ruled, that those dollars are not government dollars. When an individual is giving their money to a scholarship organization, that is not government money. That's an
Hmm.
individual donation. So, on one hand, the tax credit scholarship allowed people to get around those Blaine amendments in their state constitutions. But then there's also this argument that the tax credit scholarship does a better job of protecting private schools from government overreach. And that's a concern. We've for a long time in the United States had a pretty strong private school sector where individuals pay the tuition dollars for their own kids to go to private school. And those schools are largely run without any government oversight. I mean, very little government oversight, of course.
Hmm.
They don't dictate the curriculum, who they can hire. There's no certification requirements for teachers, those sorts of things. The concern from some people is that if we have a voucher program or some sort of direct government aid to the private schools, it opens the door for those dollars to have strings attached, right? Where the government can start regulating schools more. And many people were concerned about that. And so I think the tax credit scholarship gets its boost from those two reasons. You have the constitutional reasons and then the concern about government overreach. Those are part of the reason why we have so many tax credit scholarship programs in the United States.
Fascinating. Okay. And the last two, I mean, I wanted to ask you this as two separate definitions, but I think they could be asked together. One is we hear a lot about public school choice, which sometimes for can sound like a contradiction, but also public charter schools. Can you explain these concepts also for an European audience and also well, a non-American audience, I would say.
Yeah. Well, so public schools, I mean, all of these systems, it's funny, they're evolving over time. At the very founding of the United States, you had all kinds of different models that were, people were paying, you had some government subsidies, but over time, we had what was called the common school movement. And in this common school movement, that's where you start getting the large public bureaucracies. So you get the large public school districts where they have, many different schools in them, and they have a superintendent or one person
Mm.
over the schools, and in those districts, you are assigned to a school. So they're funded through a combination of local dollars, through local property taxes, usually, state funding, and then some federal funding. Usually about
Mhm.
10% comes from the federal government. So the public schools, generally, wherever you live, you're assigned to go to the local public school, and they have, a pattern where you're assigned to an elementary school and then a middle school and then a high school, and you generally don't have much choice in that. Well, public school choice, there are two different ways in which it's starting to take shape. One is through interdistrict choice. So, or that means moving across district lines. So, and states can have different size districts. They can have very small districts or very large districts. Florida's districts, school districts, are the size of the entire county. Missouri's school districts are very small. So interdistrict choice is when you can go from one school district to another school district. And sometimes there are rules around how that works. Sometimes you have to provide your own transportation, those sorts of things. So you have
Mhm.
that interdistrict choice. And then sometimes you have within your district, you could choose schools provided there's capacity. So you're assigned to the school that's down the street from you, but you don't want to go there. And you could choose another school within your district. Some schools are also creating what we call magnet schools. And this really came out of the sort of 1960s, 1970s in the desegregation movement of
Mhm.
public schools in the United States. The idea around magnet schools was to create a school that offers something unique and attracts people, right? And a magnet attracts people. And so you might have a school that's a performing arts school, or that's a science and technology,
Mhm.
engineering and math school, or it has some sort of unique characteristic. And the idea is to try to attract the best and brightest into those places. And so you have these in many of the inner cities, especially places that had desegregation efforts, but not always just there. And that would be another way in which people could choose a school within the public system. All of these that I'm talking about are schools that are under a local school board. And the local school board is usually elected by citizens to run their local schools. And so all of this is under that same bureaucracy. So there might be some choice within it, but it's all ultimately still governed by the same governing body. Charter schools change this dynamic a bit. So the charter school, and it operates slightly different in each state, but a charter is a form of government, right? So it's a
Mhm.
contract essentially. And rather than them being under the school board, the charter, by their contract, establishes a self-appointing board. And so they're independently governed or run as a school, but the funding is still public funding. So they
Mhm.
still receive funding, and it might be from the local school district and the state and federal government, just like public schools. Um, but they are independent. And so sometimes you can choose if a charter school is in your district, sometimes you can move across districts with that interdistrict choice we mentioned. But the idea is this is a publicly funded school, privately operated. And we're having actually right now an interesting Supreme Court discussion about charter schools,
Mhm. I heard.
about
Yeah.
whether or not they can be religious. Can't, historically, charter schools have not been religious because we've thought of them as public entities, even though they're um, even though they are privately run, we have treated them like a public entity that they couldn't be religious. But now they're challenging that to say, well, maybe they're not public entities, maybe they're private entities, and if they
Mhm.
are, they should be religious. So we'll see what our Supreme Court says about that. But the key distinction there is that historically they weren't religious and they are independently run. They're not run by the local school board.
Fascinating. That's really, yeah, that's really interesting. I have one in many countries where Oidel is active. One of the trends that we are seeing is negative. No, people have the feeling like the tendency in the years to come would be that we will have more struggles for educational pluralism and parental rights. While in some states in the United States, it feels like the tendency is just the opposite. how did you get there? How did you get into this sort of a scenario in which is so good for parents to choose the education they want for their children?
Hmm. Well, it's been a long struggle. This has not been quick. It seems quick nowadays, but this has been going on for a very, very long time. I've written a couple papers for the Journal of School Choice about this guy named Virgil Bloom and Citizens for Educational Freedom. And they were advocating for school choice policies in the 1950s, 1960s. So we have had advocates for a very long time that faced very stiff opposition and nothing much got done. And then in the 1990s and early 2000s, we started seeing the first private school choice and even charter school laws in this country. And I think one of the things that has helped it accelerate over time is what I mentioned earlier, that this is a movement that builds a constituency. You know, it's hard for people to think about school choice or support school choice when they've never had school choice, but once people start getting a taste of it, they start liking it and want to have options. And I kind of think of it a little bit like this. I'm not a car guy. I don't know much about cars. I don't know about their engines or anything related to cars. But if I'm buying a car, if my car dies on me and I think, oh my goodness, I need to buy a new car, then I start studying and paying attention. And that motivation, makes me start
Mhm.
looking around at the different options and the different features and those sorts of things. I'd say the American public historically has been like the people who didn't know anything about cars and didn't need a car, and so they weren't looking, right? They weren't looking at schools. They weren't thinking about school choice. We had one model. You bought a house or you found where you were living and you tried to choose the good neighborhood where you wanted to live so your kids could go to that school. And the housing market was the school market, right? When you chose where you lived, that's where you were going to school. But now we've opened people's eyes and we've made them consumers. We've empowered them with the ability to choose different types of school. And now they're looking, now they're paying attention, and now they're informing themselves about the different options that are out there. And so I think that's partly what we're seeing is that this movement is building over time as more people get a taste of it, more people want it, and it builds that constituency more and more.
Great. I have one last question for you. We know that among our listeners, there are people participating, as we do, in international conversations, in UN resolutions, in UNESCO recommendations. And next time someone told us, have you heard about what is happening in Florida? What do you think should be our reaction?
Your reaction should be, yes, it's great. What's going on in Florida is amazing. Um, as I said at the beginning of this, we are creating an educational marketplace that's empowering parents to choose a school aligned with their values and aligned with their vision of what they want for their kids to receive. We're creating a pluralistic system. That's the interesting word that I love that you use, because it's hard to have a pluralistic system where you force everyone to go to one single school and teach them all the exact same way. If we want to have a pluralistic system, we have to let different types of schools to flourish. And the literature is pretty clear on this, that when you allow different types of schools, you do not create more strife. You do not create more conflict, right? What we're actually see in the literature is it tends to be better when people are able to be educated in the types of schools that align with their values. I think partly the reason for that is that they feel firm, they feel secure in who they are, that they don't have to fight and contend with one another. When you force people into one place, we force them into conflict. So when we force all the communities into public schools, like we saw in the United States, you force the Protestants and the Catholics to fight over what's going to be taught in that school or the other, whatever religion it is. You force conflict. But when you allow people to choose, you allow for them to get the type of education they want to receive. And like I said, feel secure in that education, not feel like they have to fight over things all the time at the school board meetings or even violently, as we saw in some historic riots in the United States in the 1800s over what Bible was going to be read or those sorts of
Yeah.
things. So what's going on in Florida is exciting. We're growing programs, we're empowering parents, and students are excelling. So when someone asks you, have you heard about Florida? Say yes, and it's amazing.
It's awesome. No, thank you. I mean, it echoes a lot. I don't know if you knew that, but the first Secretary General of UNESCO, when they were talking about how to implement the Universal Declaration of Human Rights in a treaty, some countries, you can guess which ones, they were saying there is no need of acknowledging a plurality that individuals can create their own educational institutions. And the Secretary General of UNESCO say that's like acknowledging democracy in a one system party. That's and not acknowledging parental rights, recognizing that parents have the right to raise their children without acknowledging a plurality of actors and that these decisions do not depend on the income of the families sounds the right thing to do from a human rights perspective. No, thank you. I don't know, James. I don't know if you want to add anything else that has been really great for us. I think our audience would be really interested about everything you have said. But anything you want to add before to leave?
Well, thank you so much for having me on. I don't know if there's much else to add. I mean, the American educational system is complex. There are constant, as I mentioned before, constant battles. But I think we're moving in a very positive direction, both in Florida and in the rest of the country, to fostering greater pluralism and empowering parents and students to choose the school that's best for them. So I think it's exciting times.
Great. Thank you so much, James.
Thank you.